Believe it or not, psychopaths can be of great benefit to society. So usually when we hear the term psychopath, it comes with loads of negative connotations. We think of serial killers like Ted Bundy, Gary Ridgway. We think of the fictional killers like Hannibal Lecter. But there are millions of psychopaths that live within society who haven't killed anyone, will not kill anyone, and are functioning members of society and benefit society as a whole. So there's 3 career choices that would be a particularly good fit for a person that is psychopathic or that has psychopathic traits. And of course, it goes without saying that not everybody within these professions is a psychopath. That would obviously be insane. All I'm saying is that these are more suited to that type of personality. And everything I talk about today in terms of these career choices is evidenced by research. It's not just me talking out of my arse. So before I mention what these 3 career choices are, it makes sense to talk about what the traits are that a psychopath would have that would be beneficial. So psychopaths in general, as we know, lack empathy, so they can be quite apathetic. They also respond very differently to stressful situations than your average Joe. So they may not have an elevated heart rate, they might not get sweaty, they might not feel panicked when they're in a situation that will cause the rest of us to feel extremely scared or fearful or a flight or fight response. They could be totally fine and they might stay there and have none of that going on internally, physiologically. They tend to be quite charismatic and within that also manipulative. So they tend to be able to get what they want quite easily and to be able to influence people to get what they want quite easily. And that can be things like money, it can be items, it can be relationships, it can be anything. Anything you can think of that a psychopath might want is what they will be able to manipulate a person or persons to get. So it can be said that they also have good problem solving skills, because if they come up against a barrier, they find a way around it somehow, and they tend to stay focused on the task at hand. So if they have a goal in mind, they want to finish the task and they want to get to whatever it is at the end of this task, whatever it is that they're working for. So they stay pretty focused on what they're doing. If they do mess up and they do make a mistake, they of course never blame themselves, and they don't dwell on things that they have done wrong. Even if it was glaringly obvious that it was them that had made the mistake, they still wouldn't dwell on that. They just move on. So oddly, they tend to focus on the positives of themselves, whereas other people who aren't psychopathic would tend to focus on the negatives of themselves, which we all do quite a bit, I would say. So that's kind of a taster of why the next 3 careers you could actually do quite well if you had some of those traits that I just spoke of. Career number 1. Military, and more specifically special forces within the military. So in the UK it's the SAS. Every country has their own version of that, and as you can imagine, the SAS or any special forces, when they're going out on tasks, they literally could be risking their lives. It's a life or death situation every single time they're sent out. And when they're sent out, they sometimes don't know exactly what they're going to come up against. So they could get attacked, they could get shot at, they could get taken hostage. The covert missions that they do are so vast, so varied, and so dangerous that you can see how psychopathic traits of being able to stay focused on whatever the task is at hand, not getting stressed out, not feeling fearful, and being able to hone in on exactly it is what you need to do would be very beneficial, alongside with the fact that they're going to have to kill people along the way, which you wouldn't be able to do very well if you were, empathetic, you felt bad or guilty or shame for killing this person. That's not how a psychopath would think. They would think, I have to solve the problem. This guy or girl, whoever, is in my way, and they're going to attack me. I've got to kill them first. That's that problem removed. Boom, onto whatever the main objective was. Staying cool under pressure is expected of a person in the special forces. So although of course there's going to be plenty of people that aren't psychopaths or don't have psychopathic traits, you can see that that type of job would actually be much easier, and the soldier would be more effective if they had more of the psychopathic traits than your average person who's empathetic, who might feel guilt and shame for having killed someone, who will feel stress, will feel pressure because of the task, will be reflecting on things, will be hoping they don't mess up or do something wrong. So in that scenario, being a psychopath is actually probably a good thing. And being in the special forces or military in general, that's what some people would say is commendable for society, that's, you know, protecting your country. And being a really efficient soldier in the military, whether it's the SAS or not, means that you are being a productive member of society. Career number 2, surgeon. So this is a good one because surgery in general can obviously be incredibly high stress situation. You can imagine that you make one mistake and the person on the operating table dies, and then you have to tell the family, you know, their wife, their father, their child is now dead. So the traits that would really benefit a surgeon would be that they, of course, don't have any empathy for the person they're operating on. So emotions aren't clouding their decision making in the time that's completely removed, and they're only focusing on whatever the task is via the operation. Psychopaths in general are extremely assertive, so they'll make decisions. They tend not to dwell and take ages to make decisions like some of the rest of us do. They'll do things pretty quickly, pretty snappy, and that's what you have to do in a situation where there's a surgery. If something goes horribly wrong, you have to think fast, think on your feet, like, okay, how am I going to fix this? Boom, boom, boom. And the fact that they don't feel, you know, like stress and pressure in the same way that a person without psychopathy would, is beneficial, because then they can make decisions, probably better decisions, because they have none of that fear, none of that pressure, none of that stress. When they're making a decision, it's very clear, they can see things clearly, nothing clouds the judgment. It's just in the here and now, how am I going to solve this problem? What's the quickest way to do it? And the end goal, of course, is for the person on the table to have a successful operation and survive. When you think of your loved ones going to surgery, you obviously want the most effective, efficient surgeon that there's going to be, especially if it's going to be an operation that goes on for, you know, 16 hours. You're going to want somebody who knows exactly what they're doing, who's not going to be distracted, who's going to focus on your loved one 100% to get to the end goal of having them come out of the operation room alive and recover. And then on the flip side of that, if something actually does go wrong, and say even if it's beyond the control of the surgeon, it wasn't their mistake and the patient did just die and there was nothing they could do about it, the delivering the news to the loved ones, parents, sisters, brothers, whatever, mum or dad, is not going to be the same as it would be if a person without psychopathic traits had to deliver that news. So they would be able to deliver the news but not be affected by it. It wouldn't stay with them. They'd be able to deliver the news and then get on with their day, because they wouldn't have the same emotional experience in delivering that news than somebody who wasn't a psychopath. And I think at this point it's also important to remember that just because psychopaths don't feel empathy, emotional empathy, doesn't mean that they don't know how and when to use cognitive empathy, which is basically knowing how to look, knowing what to say, and knowing what to do in order to look like you're empathetic. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you've got emotional empathy, so you don't feel empathy towards other people. You can't feel what it's like to be in their shoes. You can't feel what it could be like to feel what they're feeling. You don't relate to them in that way. But to them, it might look like you do. Because remember, they're very charismatic, they're very charming. So just because they're psychopathic and they're delivering that terrible news doesn't necessarily mean they're delivering it in a way that's negative, or that's going to be hard for the family to accept, or that's going to be insensitive. It actually could be quite the opposite. A surgeon who has those psychopathic traits would obviously be very effective and very efficient. So again, that's another career that benefits society, because at some point, touch wood, hopefully we won't, but usually at some point we'll all need a surgery in our lives. And interestingly, Professor Dutton did a survey and he discovered that most of the psychopaths, or people with psychopathic traits, were actually in the surgery niche of medicine. So they weren't usually doctors or GPs or anything like that. They all found their way to surgery. So that's quite interesting. It probably gets them going in a way that another career they might kind of see as too mundane, that it would be very boring for them. Because remember, psychopaths get bored very easily. They usually need a lot of stimulation to keep them going. I need a drink. I'm on my day off. Don't judge me. Career number 3. Solicitors or lawyers in America. So this one's kind of obvious, because these people, for their everyday life, they might be cross-examining victims of horrific crimes. It could be rape victims. It could be family members of murdered victims. And in doing so, there might be cross-examinations where they have to basically contradict this person's version of events, who is essentially a victim, and break them down, pick the story apart, and essentially call them a liar. And you'll see that the people that are being questioned often break down on the stand because it's just so intense and so much pressure. So for a psychopath, being able to remove the emotional empathy from that situation would make it a lot easier to be able to cross-examine victims of horrific crimes, because you wouldn't have that same emotional attachment. You wouldn't feel guilty, you wouldn't feel remorse, you wouldn't feel shame for doing that. All you'd be focused on is the end goal, and the end goal of that is to win your trial. And by proxy of winning the trial, you're going to have to discredit all of these witnesses or victims or whoever along the way that didn't deserve it. But if you're in the way and you're a witness or a victim or whatever, they need to do what they have to do to get around you as a barrier to get to their end objective, which is to win the case. So again, if they don't have the emotional empathy, that's going to be pretty easy for them. And that's why you'll hear stories sometimes of solicitors and lawyers, after they win cases or after they cross-examine victims, they're able to just head down to the pub and have some beers. And for a lot of people that would seem quite strange to be able to do that after they've just completely ruined someone on the stand. So in that context, you can see how being ruthless, how being callous, how being driven to get to the end of the goal, how being assertive, because people change their stories quite often, and sometimes you need to think fast. Being a solicitor or a lawyer, you need to be able to problem solve there and then, because if someone comes up with new information, you got to think, how am I going to discredit that quickly, because the jury, whoever, are going to see that, be influenced by it. I need to quickly turn that back around. And again, because a psychopath wouldn't feel the same pressure that a regular Joe would feel, and the same stress because of something like that, it's going to be a lot easier for them to think clearly, stay focused. Okay, what am I going to do here? How am I going to solve it? What's the fastest way? Boom, 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 boom. And with all the careers that I mentioned, things can go wrong in all of those. Like an SAS officer can, mess up a mission. A surgeon can accidentally mess up a surgery. A solicitor or a lawyer can lose the case because they poorly cross-examined somebody. And again, psychopaths being psychopaths aren't going to feel bad about that. They're not going to blame themselves. They're just going to focus on what they did good in all of those situations, whereas the rest of us would only focus on what we did bad. So it is kind of strange that the psychopath will always see the positive in himself. I don't think we tend to think of psychopaths in that way, and we definitely don't tend to think of them as being a benefit to society. But you can see from these careers that there definitely are some careers where they would be more effective and more efficient if they had some of those psychopathic traits or were a psychopath. There's a really good book by Andy McNabb. He is an ex-soldier from the SAS, and he's a diagnosed psychopath. He actually only found out after he got out of the SAS, and he talks a lot about how his traits helped him to be the best soldier that he could possibly be. And he chose, without even knowing that he was a psychopath, chose a life where he could benefit society in some way, where he could help society in some way. So, the large majority of psychopaths do that. And then of course there's obviously the minority of psychopaths that choose not to do that and go on to murder people to gain control and to get fuel, whereas these other guys do positive things to gain control and get fuel from other people. But I think it's important to say, in all of these careers, it's great that that's, a super kind of benefit of being a psychopath within those careers. The psychopath, by nature of their illness, is still going to engage in manipulative tactics to gain control and fuel over people. What I mean by that is, just because they're excelling in a career and they're benefiting society in that way, That doesn't mean that then they just aren't in any way abusive to anyone else in their entire lives. They're still psychopaths at the end of the day, and they're still going to idolize, devalue and discard people. It's going to be incredibly difficult for them to stop doing that by proxy of their illness. So I think that's the kind of take home of the psychopath. It's all about them, but they can harness it for the greater good. But yeah, it doesn't mean that I'll be, running off to become friends with a psychopath. Hope you enjoyed the video, guys. I really want to make one on coercive control soon, because I'm really passionate about that in those types of relationships and the 8 stages. But until then, which hopefully will be very soon, I hope you enjoyed the video and have a good one. Cheers.